break it. Don't make the rest, you won't make it. I don't even care where this road leads. All I know is when my heart...
Ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, it's your boy Chris Shule, aka the Esoteric Noetic, aka the Chocolate Nubian Soul Brother from Ghana, West Africa. Oh, it has been a crazy month. I've been traveling around the world, doing my thing, trying to keep apprised of what's going on in the world, but also trying to stay away from all the lockdown and the restrictions. I have written my first book. I got a new book. It's called Vegan Prince, Warrior King. It's all about expanding the level of passion we have to all the fellow earthlings. You guys can check that out if you want to get a first insight. If you follow us on the Patreon, I can give you the first drop, but probably going to release that next month. What else is going on in my world? I'm doing my music. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to like the video, subscribe, click on the bell, tell your friends, check out this cool, knowledgeable cat right here, King Peter the Virile. Give us a review on iTunes. Also, just get this stuff out there, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like podcasts are the main medium to disseminate information in the 21st century. I mean, you have a look at the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, and that reaches 11 million people every episode. And my podcast, I mean, I reach about 21 million. Obviously, everyone knows about me. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, you got to share this. We got to get this information out there because the mainstream media is not doing a good job getting the truth out there. They don't even like people that are questioning the science. Anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce King Peter the Virile. This cat is someone I've had on the podcast several times now. He is a citizen journalist, content creator, researcher based in the UK. He's got these traditional values. He truly is a king, but he's also a man of the people, which is good to see. And over the last few months, we've been chatting. He's been keeping me apprised of what's going on in the UK. And whereas we've covered a lot of stuff going on in terms of the agenda, in terms of the mass mandates, the boom shakalaka, the juice, as I like to call it. I found out this cat is really deep into the other conspiracies. So I thought we'd even expand our topic area on this podcast and go even deeper into the world of weird science and freaking magic, as I like to call it. But Peter, how are you doing, man? What's been going on in the world? Apparently you're an uncle. How's that? How does that feel?
I am now. It's pretty crazy. I wasn't expecting it. But I mean, I guess the thing is it's like a big thing, but at the same time, it's like when you reach a certain age or whatever, you just feel the same as you did the day before. But no, it really does drum home the importance of family, or the importance of when you see a newborn baby, you see this sort of completely innocent person that's just been brought into the world, completely ready to be shaped by the environment, and it's an awful world that kids are growing up in these days. So I think even more so, we all have a responsibility to do what we can and speak up and try and shape the world into a more positive place for future generations.
Absolutely. That's what the wisest men have always said, that when you start thinking about the future for your family, for your kids, it drives you to want to do more in this world. I'm driven because I just don't like bullies, period. But we're moving into a future where kids are not going to understand what it is to be free. And I've often heard the view that, a lot of these anti-vaxxers are selfish. They're not considered about passing this virus on to the grannies. But ultimately, they're the least selfish because they're not acquiescing to these mandates because they truly care about what's going to happen to not their freedoms per se, but the freedoms of their friends, their family, their kids. These little boys and girls that you're bringing into the world, and what's going to happen to these values that have essentially created Western civilization. I mean, now kids don't even know what sex they are. Well, apparently, wait, I can't say that, right? There is no male and female. Everything's a spectrum. So it definitely makes you a bit more trepidatious about just the prospects for your children. But how are you coping with everything, brother? Apparently the UK has become this bastion of freedom. It seems like things are on the up and up for you guys.
It has everything. I think a large part of this is with our protest movement. When you look at how it's developed in different countries, it seems like for some reason the UK was one of the first. I mean, pretty much from day one, there was very, very small, admittedly, but small little protests from the very start. in local parks and things. And the first protest I went to was the first really, really big one in August 2020. And that filled Trafalgar Square, at least 20,000 people. And then it was followed the following month, double the size, enormous crowd flowing out the square. And that was when the police were storming in and cracking skulls and grabbing people and kettling the crowd. And there were all these very intense marches. But the atmosphere shifted over a period of a few months. I'd say it reached its peak in around summer 2021. And the protests were enormous. There were the estimates were the protests, and I believe it was May, were anywhere from 750,000 up to 2 million. And when you see some of the drone footage from above, it's not hard to believe those estimates. So we had it sort of fairly early on, fairly intense and fairly consistent. Whereas in a lot of these countries, the protests were on a much smaller scale, and they're only now reaching such a huge level. And as a result, people are even more angry and tense. And you're seeing the results like in what's going on in Ottawa, and of course, what's been going on in Australia, in Canberra. So does it look like there's any chance of restrictions easing at all over there?
Well, if what happened in the UK is anything to go by, absolutely. I mean, I remember a while back I spoke to you, and you were taking a jab at Australia, talking about how we were perhaps still caught up with our convict roots, and the protests in the UK were doing such an amazing job, but we were barely having the thousands here. But over the last few months, we have seen more and more people wake up every day. We've gone from 10,000s to hundreds of thousands. Now, granted, the media is still projecting this narrative that it's not really going down. But recently in Canberra, I've heard estimates of multiple millions, like 3 million people all around Australia. I mean, our population here is what, like maybe 25 million. So I think the UK is maybe, I think a little more than that. But in fairness, man, I mean, we have a much smaller population, and we've had millions of people amass themselves at the Parliament steps in Canberra to say no to what the government has been doing. So a lot of people are waking up. And I think part of it is the fact that you can only push Australians so far. There's this attitude that we're laid back. She'll be right, mate. Yeah, no, mate, it's all good. 2 weeks to flatten the curve, or 1 year, 2 years. All right. Look, mate, I've had enough of this. I'm not doing it anymore. And that's the stage we're at the moment. I think people have just had enough. The government started mandating this stuff on children. The government has moved from, oh, look, it's just a couple of weeks to flatten the curve, to booster shots. Now, according to I think Ataji or something like that is this organization that regulates all this nonsense. You need to have three of these jabs in order to be recognized as fully boom shakalakad. So that, combined with just no sign of the mandates dropping in Western Australia, they're essentially not allowing parents to go and see their children if they're in hospital, unless, of course, they've gotten an exemption. I mean, we can see that this stuff is not slowing down. And as a result, we're really living up to the Anzac spirit now. And granted, the media is not covering it, but yeah, I think things are going to get better here. And it's encouraging to see all around the world, not just in the UK, Mexico, El Salvador, Denmark, all of these countries, they're doing a 180. And then, of course, you see what's going on in Canada. That is, yes. It's so fascinating, man, because there are elements of, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, the government, they were, I was watching the Ontario Premier's press conferences, and he was very reassuring in saying that definitely we're not going to negotiate with these terrible people who are holding our city to siege. We're not going to negotiate with them at all. Also, by the way, we're going to ease our mandates. Also, we're going to ease back on all of our restrictions. So they're obviously giving in.
Are you talking about Trudeau saying this?
No, this was Premier Ford. So he was the governor of Ontario, so the province with Ottawa. So in the because a lot of the restrictions are on a provincial level rather than national. So these were provincial mandates, like for getting into restaurants and public places. He announced the other day that he was planning on scrapping them. He announced today that from March the 1st, There'll be no vaccine mandates for anyone with any capacity, employment, access to venues, anything like that, and they'll be scrapping venue entry requirements as well. So the people are winning, and they're trying to make it look like they don't want to negotiate with them. The people don't have power, and it's why the mainstream press tries to downplay them as fringe and far right, and they're all lunatics and all this nonsense. And the people are entirely peaceful. I think New Zealand was another example where, admittedly, it doesn't look like the government's backing down at the moment, but you probably saw outside their parliament where the protesters were camping out, and they were spraying them with sprinklers and then blasting them out with Barry Manilow and Baby Shark. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I did hear you mention that. That's crazy. They're playing. They're playing music as a form of resistance protest. I gotta love that, you know. On one hand, the media is painting these anti-vaxxers as being incredibly violent, you know. Like there's this beautiful video I saw where Trudeau is talking about how these protesters are racist, they're sexist, they're violent, when ultimately in juxtaposition to all this footage of them, just showing compassion towards one another, feeding the homeless, being very thoughtful in obeying the police and all that kind of stuff, but fundamentally being strong in their unwillingness to acquiesce to these mandates. I mean, these people are just normal citizens. Now, granted, it's the small minority at this point that have not been vaccinated. Even the ones that have. I mean, I often see people at these protests that have been boom shakalaked, but are very much against these restrictions, you know, because they feel there's this feeling you get when you do something you don't want to do, but you've been coerced to do it, and you're frustrated, you want to lash out, and you also want to let people know it's not all right to do that stuff again. You know, I mean, this is the situation we're in. Just because people have taken this jab doesn't mean we're not united on the front that this stuff is not down. And what's interesting about New Zealand, by the way, so check this out. Jacinta Ardern, I read this. She has called the protesters as like this whole protesting thing, she said it's an import. Like there's this idea that, oh, what's going on in the United States, all the protesting, that's just something that happens there. Like New Zealanders, they're quite happy with all these restrictions. I've heard the same thing in Australia, like, oh, what are you talking about all these rights, you know? Like, look, man, we don't care about rights here. People don't seem to understand that this is a universal thing. People, regardless of where they're from, typically don't like the idea of being forced to take. So once again, man, like it's crazy.
Plus, in New Zealand as well,
yeah,
talking about imports, aren't they imported as well? Yeah, like they're imported into the country. I mean, isn't the entirety of New Zealand as it exists today based on imported cultures?
Yeah, I guess just using the phrase import, it's more to suggest that New Zealanders, no, it's not like a racial thing. It's just that New Zealanders typically are not down with the American values.
It's a crazy American far right QAnon thing that was spread here through not enough restrictions on Telegram or something like that. They're going to say.
Absolutely, it's becoming more and more difficult for the media project these crazy people as anti-vaxxers when you have people like me. You know, I'm a black African male, you know, that should be on the left, that should be in support of all this stuff. You find people like Robert Malone, that is, if anything, he was like a hardcore proponent of the juice, but now
he's the inventor of the mRNA.
The inventor of the stuff. But these people are coming out and openly talking about common sense, that, you know, there should be choice, that these things are violations of bioethical standards. And like, have you seen what's happened to Joe Rogan at the moment? It's hilarious.
Yes.
Because the media,
he apologized. That's the thing. You never apologize, never give an inch, or they will take they'll take everything they can get.
That's true.
They've just been digging everything out. They've been, what was it? There was a clip from like 10 years ago where he was like quoting a song and used the N-word. And so that they're trying to destroy his career over that or something.
Absolutely. And you see the lengths at which, look, I don't know if this is a concerted effort, but basically Spotify has pulled a bunch of his interviews over the last, I think it's over the last week or so. And strangely enough, they're not related per se to the juice, to anything that's been going on over the last, like some of these interviews were conducted years ago prior to 2020, but they've just, it's like, I don't know if they're trying to clean up his image to erase any evidence of him saying the N-word or saying inappropriate things. I mean, that's what made the Joe Rogan Experience podcast interesting. But there is this massive, like essentially what happened is a whole bunch of people came out and said, look, Spotify, we got to censor Joe Rogan. And I think it's possible that Spotify has perhaps, budged a little and they've decided to maybe take some of these things down. But the beautiful thing is you can't cancel Joe Rogan. He's that big. He's literally the biggest media figure in the world right now that is non-mainstream media. I mean, I heard a while ago that something like one of these mainstream news channels gets maybe 500,000 views an episode, but you have Joe Rogan getting 11 million downloads and everything else included. So it makes you realize that if that people are tuning into him, it would make sense that the vast majority of people not only know what's going on, but they probably don't buy the narrative, because Joe started off being very kind of pro, yeah, look what's going on. But this is another thing. You mentioned that Joe pretty much apologized, right? Like he's actually just been very honest and explained that I thought this was brilliant, that the mainstream media needs to do a better job and be more critical of what's going on to combat what he's doing, because the problem is they've stopped so many things up. They've gotten so many things wrong. I mean, one of the reasons why he's kind of done this full on, oh, I need to speak to more people, because the narrative, which was that masks are super effective, the juice is super effective, lockdowns are super effective. Now the science has changed openly. Like the CDC has now come out and announced that, masks are not as effective as we thought they were. The juice, not as effective as we thought it was.
Lockdowns apparently only prevented 0.2% of deaths.
Absolutely. So it's like, well, if the mainstream media got this stuff wrong, well, maybe I need to start asking questions and speak to the experts and try to figure out different perspectives. And this is what Joe Rogan is doing. And now, because he is questioning the science, which, by the way, the people that were not questioning the science, they've actually proven to be wrong. And now it's funny because these same people are calling us disseminators of misinformation, where 6 months ago, essentially, the stuff that they were spouting was disinformation. So it's just a weird situation. And Joe Rogan has finally come out and he's doing the good work now. And now he's been targeted. But I keep saying in my videos, man, the truth will come out, and it is.
Well, it is. I think that's the thing. I definitely don't disagree with Joe Rogan's message, actually, and I completely agree with the idea of openness. That's the way to actually find the truth is through honest inquiry. And it's why I object to a lot of what the mainstream media does with fact checkers and we are the arbiters of truth. And if you say anything that goes against us, you're therefore fake news. It's a very authoritarian, totalitarian sort of mindset. The problem is that Joe Rogan in that message did apologize. And it's the fact that the mainstream media, because when you're on his level, you need to realize the mainstream media are going to do anything they can to try and get you when you become public enemy number one. So they're going to take that as Joe Rogan apologizes for being an awful racist and that sort of thing. And then they phrase it to make him look like a complete villain rather than, it's the best thing is you've got to really be careful with how you engage with the enemy, really.
That's true. But I guess the issue there is he didn't really apologize per se. Like he came out, from what I understand, and said maybe he could have done a better job doing this and that, given him a broader take on things. But because he interviews people that he wants and he has his own take on things, perhaps it comes across as one-sided, which is fair. But the mainstream media, they will take anything and project this crazy narrative. And unfortunately, this is what you're dealing with, that people will obfuscate your arguments. People will straw man you. And that's why I guess you have to be so incredibly clear and so incredibly, passionate about your stance. Otherwise, they will twist it. I heard Jordan Peterson speak about his experience, because he went through a lot of backlash when he came out a few years back. I think it was 2016 now, and said that, look, as far as the whole gender pronoun thing, he's not going to buy into it. Look, he's not going to be forced to call people by their pronouns, and he's not going to be an advocate for compelled speech. And because he took on this stance and didn't back it an inch, essentially, yeah, he got a lot of backlash, but eventually things started turning in his favor. And then he started becoming the most looked up guy when it comes to this information. And now he is an absolute powerhouse. And he was saying that this is eventually what will happen to Joe Rogan, even though he is, if he holds true. But as soon as you give an inch, these people will they'll just keep on adding more fuel to the fire. Have you experienced that kind of stuff? Because whereas you've had, I mean, I'd say that you're generally a likable person on YouTube. I don't think you get much criticism, but have you had any issues that force you to kind of take a step back and apologize because you perhaps stepped over the boundaries? Because I know a while back, PayPal decided to shut your account down, perhaps to teach you a lesson. Did you change your tune a little, or what's going on?
No, to be honest, I don't really believe in apologies unless it's something sincere on a personal level. So it's to a person you know and you've personally wronged them, and you genuinely mean it and you genuinely want to make amends. That's the time for an apology. But generally, where it's something like, say for example, I did something wrong in the past on a video or something like that, rather than necessarily apologizing. I mean, it would depend on the context. Of course, an apology could be warranted, but for the most part, actions speak louder than words. And so rather than wanting to apologize and talk myself out of a situation with words, prove that I've changed, or prove that I'm not going to make that same mistake again, rather than an actual demonstration to and that's sort of something I'm trying to do at the moment a little bit with I've been very, very bad with my uploads, very, very inconsistent. But I want to sort of get back to posting more frequently. So I want to post at least once a week going forwards. And it's a case where rather than making an announcement, hello, this is going to be my upload schedule, I'm going to upload this day and this day, and then if something goes wrong, something happens and I'm not able to upload on a certain day or whatever, rather than having me necessarily beholden to that and disappointing people, I'd rather have my actions create the expectation. So build an image through actions rather than just talking yourself up like you're a fraud. Basically, it's proving yourself with actions.
Absolutely. I've found myself trying to do the same thing. Rather than saying I'm going to do this, like I'm going to leave the country, I'm going to do that, I'd rather just do it, because the reality is, one, you're going to run into challenges. It's kind of difficult, particularly in this day and age, to follow through because we're in a state of flow. And it's better to let your actions speak louder than your words, unlike these politicians that are doing the exact opposite right now. Yeah.
All words, no actions.
Yeah. So just for those that don't know, I mean, King Peter has a YouTube channel. I think you've only been there for a little over a year, and you had this rapid growth that was going on. Now, granted, I know you've taken a step back with the uploads, but I think we're speaking about this. There has been this concerted effort by YouTube to censor content like ours that goes against the narrative. And as a result, we're not seeing the same level of growth. Like I have definitively seen a lot of my videos not just being targeted as far as taken down, but I can see that there is some kind of shadow banning that's going on. I'm starting to see a decline now in subscribers. And look, there are all of these metrics that put in place. I mean, I am now a figure of not to be trustedness, on Instagram. I mean, people, if they try to follow me, and I like this, I actually get annoyed sometimes when it seems to have disappeared, but people will get a warning if they try to follow me. And it just shows that there's this massive push to take away anyone that puts on information against the norm. I mean, even Spotify, that is supposed to be pretty free now, I mean, they've allowed the Robert Malone podcast. I found out from Robert Malone just recently that the owner of Spotify is also the biggest shareholder of the Pfizer, or it might be Moderna, I can't remember. So it goes to show that there is there's definitely a lot of fuckery at foot, as Joe Rogan likes to say,
But it's also, I saw something just in the Times, I think it was yesterday, and it was an article. I don't know if you remember on YouTube a few years ago, the Adpocalypse, when that happened.
No.
When it was a couple of YouTubers. It was they uncovered. I think it was when political YouTube was starting to blow up, and then there was a lot more. It was less professional than it is today. It used to be a lot of bedroom feminists saying some nonsense, and then some guy with a cartoon avatar saying, "This is why you're an idiot." And that's it was in those days of sort of the Wild West of YouTube political content. I think it was the Wall Street Journal, or one of the American newspapers, put out a long editorial about his all these adverts that are running on this terrible, destructive content. And then all these various companies got really, really panicky and pulled their ads out of YouTube completely. And YouTube lost loads of money. And so they responded by introducing the demonetize thing. So before then, you could monetize any video you wanted, no problems. And after that point, they then introduced, the orange dollar sign, you've been demonetized. So I can't actually monetize my channel anyway, so it doesn't make a damn difference to me. But what the Times is doing was they ran an an editorial about how ads appearing on videos of people who are spreading misinformation about the deadly virus, and that kind of fake news stuff, even though the overwhelming majority of that content doesn't have ads on YouTube anyway. It's got it all struck off. But the Times was running this fear piece, and obviously the end goal of it is to try and get YouTube to crack down more on demonetizing more content and taking money away from people who are content creators. And as journalists writing for the Times, they should realize that they themselves are a form of content creator. Just because you object to what someone else says and they have a differing opinion doesn't give you the right to take food away from them and say that they can't live and they can't provide for themselves. That's authoritarian. I know it's an overused word, but that is incredibly fascistic.
Oh, 100%. But the interesting thing is I watch all of these mainstream news channels, and the argument people opposed to this often make is that, yeah, they all believe in freedom of speech, but there's always a but, right? But they say when it comes to health, it's not acceptable because these arguments or your opinions could do a lot of harm, right? Like any opinion, like the idea that any opinion can't potentially do harm. People seem to be so philosophically illiterate in the realization that, yes, in the same way that bad health information can do harm, bad information, period, can do harm. If you tell someone that they are not a male, they're female, and they're no sexes, that can potentially do harm as well, psychological damage. Any kind of misinformation, like if you're far-reaching enough, I mean,
but that's the wrong opinion, though. That's the wrong opinion.
Yeah.
The mainstream opinion is that you can change your gender, like humans are just like Komodo dragons or something, and we can just magically change our gender. So if you say that, even though that is biologically a fact, that is some type of hate speech, and therefore, I say you should be shut down and you shouldn't speak. If you say something that I don't agree with, you should be completely silent. You shouldn't have any right to free speech. In fact, we're going to try and stir up a moral panic to either have you deprived of your income or, in some cases, thrown in a jail cell. That's how it's going over here with the press in the UK. I think that's the biggest concern at the moment in the UK, now that we've moved away from restrictions and everything. The biggest concern has to be the online safety bill. And there are lots of reforms that this is going to make to the internet. For example, anyone who knowingly shares false information online can face up to 5 years in prison.
How do you even prove that? Like, I've heard you often talk about mens rea, which is the like knowing that you're actually doing something that is illegal, and I mean, how do you prove that with an illegal concept? I mean,
well, I'm guessing, it obviously hasn't passed into law yet, but I'm guessing it would be the legal test for dishonesty, which I think is genting casinos. So it used to be for a very long time that to prove someone was dishonest, it was firstly that the average person, the reasonable person in the community would realize that person's conduct was dishonest, and that person themselves realized that the average person would consider their conduct to be dishonest, which was a sort of fairly reasonable mens rea. But it was, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, they changed it with the case of genting casinos, and it became a new dishonesty test, which for the life of me I actually can't remember right now. But it's a stricter definition in that it minimizes the mens rea on the defendant's part and places it more as a less subjective and more objective legal test, meaning it's more about whether the court decides that they were acting dishonestly rather than placing the emphasis on mens rea. So they minimize that impact in common law.
Sure, but how's the court going to be more objective than the general masses? I mean, I'd say the courts are just as likely, if not more, to be influenced by, pharmaceutical companies and like corporations in terms of the verdicts. So we have this very subjective system for determining. I mean, you have a look at what's going on with the politicians right now. Would they pass the average test for committing fraud? When everyone looks at what Trudeau is saying, like the people that are at these protests, they're somehow being violent, they're sexist and so forth. And he's saying that, they're against freedom. I mean, any sane person looks at that and they're like, yeah, Trudeau, no, we kind of know that you're not in favor of freedom. So you're a bit of a liar there. But of course, he gets away with it because he's a politician and he has all of these people that are, well, actually, it's moving away from that. Even as the Liberal Party are not in favor of the stuff he's been saying. But I hear what you're saying, man. Like,
Well, they're destroying people's lives. Justin Trudeau is destroying people's lives. It's why the protests in Ottawa are justifiable in the way that they're happening. So say, for example, over here, there are organizations where it's about, about gender realism rather than the trans ideology. And whenever they show up or any member shows up anywhere, there's massive counter protests and huge protesters swarming the streets. So that's an instance where, you don't really have a right necessarily to infringe on other people, because just because they're saying certain opinions, they're not necessarily harming anyone. So that's where, protests for speech isn't so much of a big deal. Whereas what's happening in Ottawa is the government are literally telling people, or they were telling people until they acquiesced, but they were telling people that you can't effectively work. We're going to deprive you of your living. You won't be able to feed your family. And when the government does that and uses that kind of force on the people, that is effectively an act of violence, you could argue, in forcefully depriving people.
I mean, people
it's coercion,
misunderstanding that coercion isn't a form of violence. Like I call it, because they seem to inflate like ultimatums with what I would call violent coercion. But when a government tells you that you can't leave your home, and I want to be clear about this, tells you that you can't defend yourself even with a gun, you can't do basic things. I mean, it puts you in a position where you have to defend yourself or allow yourself to be violated. I mean, if someone came into my house and they decided to rape me and told me that I couldn't resist, I mean, essentially that's a form of violence. I mean, the idea of me resisting and me being the violent person is insane. But that's very different to a situation where someone says, look, it's my house here. You can't come in. And look, I'm sorry, but like, if you come in and you're not vaccinated, I'm going to kick you out, so you can either get vaccinated in my house. This is where I know it's a little contentious, but like if it's your property and you give someone an ultimatum, it's my property over here. Well, that's an ultimatum. That's not coercion. But they seem to be inflated in this day and age where now people are doing things that they don't have the right to and saying that it's not coercion. And that's where the problem arises, because Trudeau absolutely, like he's openly said at the moment that he's going to fine people $100,000 if they continue with these protests. They have a right to, assemble, freedom of assembly. I mean, that's the case in the United States. I would imagine the same in Canada. I mean, these are universal rights. And now people, simply because they don't want to continue with this agenda, like these convoys, essentially it's their trucks, they decided to protest in defense of the government infringing on their rights. So essentially they're acting defensively. Now Trudeau has said, well, look, you guys are endangering people, this airy-fairy argument. So now we're going to fine you. So he's the one that's actually being violent by like if I threaten to threats are actually a form of violence, if they're not within your right. Like I can't tell you to do something that I don't have the right to tell you to do. But this is what we're seeing going on. I think it comes down to people's obfuscated understanding of just justice, like through the education system, people don't have these conversations. This stuff has been taken out of the curriculum. Here in Australia, we stopped teaching the Constitution back in '73, and it's just been infused with this obfuscated leftist agenda. And I hate using these terms left and right because they've been obfuscated over time. But fundamentally, this is about freedom. This is about justice. This is about law. And people call it politics, but it really comes down to like justice. And we're now living in a world where tyranny is the norm, right? Well, you've obviously gone through. Yeah, sorry, go on.
It's like a police officer on the street. They can go up to you and they can use force. They can beat you up if you act in a way that they perceive as going against their legal code. You couldn't walk up to a police officer and beat them up for violating, the code that you're operating on. You could form your own private company and say, we're going to enforce this code of the streets, and then beat up the police. No, what would happen is they'd move in and use all kind of force, and if necessary, kill you, because that's the way these governments operate. Is when these people protested or backed all these mainstream narratives following all the shady events like the Hillsborough massacre and the Dunblane over here, when their people were cheering on having their gun rights taken away, that wasn't taking guns out of England. That was taking the guns away from everyone but the government. Only the government still gets their guns, but the people have no capacity to defend themselves. So even legally, there are certain situations under Section 76 of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act in which you could be able to use force that you deem necessary and proportionate in the heat of the moment to prevent a crime. And if that's a police officer who is unlawfully detaining someone or attacking someone, as there are countless videos of them doing, then you lawfully have that ability, but in reality you don't, because they send an armed police unit, they got them all there with assault rifles, and they, if necessary, can kill you, and the police do kill people, that's generally the problem, is the balance of power, and it's how it's not effective democracy when this system exists and protects itself and says, we don't do, because that's what the Canadian Premier Ford was saying, was in Ontario. He was saying that we don't operate this way by coming to the streets and having direct action. We operate democratically. You've got to go to the ballot box. And the problem is, with the ballot box, that's only for certain select politicians. Now, granted, I'm not super familiar with the Canadian electoral system, but over here in the UK, we've got a first past the post system. So it's in each constituency, they elect an MP rather than a proportional representation. And the way this whole first past the post system works, and the amount of money in politics, means that it's only really set up between the major parties, the Tories and the Labour Party, and to a lesser degree, the Lib Dems. And there isn't a viable option outside the electoral system that will ever manifest if we go through entirely democratic in their understanding of the word means. It would never stand any chance of toppling them. And that's why these politicians stand there and go, we've got to do it through the ballot, is they're protecting their own self-interest. That's what got them there, and that's what preserves their position there at the top.
Absolutely. And obviously it's easy to obfuscate the democratic process when you have all this money and you have all of your friends in power. I mean, whether or not it's through the voting system. I think some organization within Australia recently announced that it's likely that we're going to see some kind of fuckery afoot with the upcoming elections. And I think this is something we're going to see more and more of. I think my whole attitude on this is, unless people understand that the power is really within them, it doesn't need to be voted for. Like, I don't need to vote for someone in order to acknowledge the fact that I have these unalienable God-given rights, that someone shouldn't have the right to coerce me into doing things if I'm not harming anyone in the process. It's just something, and I guess it comes about through understanding, like someone like yourself, you've been through the conventional like schooling when it comes to law. Like, you studied law, you have a much deeper understanding of this stuff than most people, and you've also thought about it. You're incredibly well read with a whole variety of topics, and I think because you have this understanding of history, but also law, philosophy, and so forth, you're able to arrive at these thoughts. I think we're just not learning about a lot of the stuff that has happened in the past right now, because people wouldn't be using, if people could see what has happened, if we allow these things, like these systems where the government has too much power, they'd finally say, yeah, I'm not down with that. And I actually want to delve into this a little. Like, I think history is really important in our understanding of just moving forward as a society. And I think so much of it has been hidden, so much of it has been corrupted. And it's not just in the realm of politics, but one of the things that we often talk about, one of my biggest obsessions is ancient history, going into even areas like alternative history, because there are, in the same way that there are two narratives right now in regards to what is happening in this world. One narrative is that the world is being saved by this juice, and that everyone is suffering from the worst pandemic to ever hit the universe, ever. And then there's another narrative. I won't say that because this is going to be on YouTube, but in the same way, there is one perspective on history that says that the earth has only been around for a few thousand years. I mean, there's the Christian perspective, where I would say a lot of like fundamentalist Christians believe in this interpretation, the earth is only like 10,000 years old or something like that. And then there are all these different versions, but I go into this realm where I look at a lot of the ancient texts dealing with history, what we call mythology, essentially the British. I'm gonna call you guys out. Like, they went into places like India, they look at their mythology and say, well, look at the history, and they say, oh, this doesn't make sense, because a lot of this stuff does sound woo-woo. We're gonna call this mythology. We'll go to your area here, Yeah, well, that doesn't coincide with our worldview. We'll call that mythology. But there's a lot of pertinent information here that uncovers the history of the world, that paints a very different picture. And this is when we get into stories dealing with the origin of mankind. This is the stuff that I love to delve into. Like we move into topics like extraterrestrials, this idea that these gods, that we look at were perhaps beings from a more sophisticated civilization, even a spacefaring civilization. We look at even some of the conventional stories about government, like what happened in Roswell, things like that, which are clearly obfuscated, right? And this is more recent history. We learn from other sources that, oh, wait a sec, the government has actually been, in the same way that they've been lying to us about what's going on with the science, right? That has been going on in the realm of what I call the black ops. I mean, there's the people have actually come out, people like government officials with high clearances. There's this classic book, none dare call it Conspiracy, which is a must read for anyone that wants to really know how government works. And this is coming from someone that worked deep within the ranks. And this is ostensibly factual information. And then we go into the more esoteric people that have actually dealt with the black ops, that speak about how, yes, there is a tremendous amount of the budget that goes into these organizations, and they're dealing with things that would never be allowed to come out. They assassinate people for saying the wrong things. They believe that people, if they were to discover the real history of the world, would not be able to deal with it. Therefore, they hide this stuff in terms of what's really going on with extraterrestrials, what's really going on with a whole bunch of stuff like mind control. And we don't need to go that deep to realize that the government covers up a lot of this data. So I guess my question to you, like, you're someone that has actually delved into some of this stuff. We've had some interesting conversations over the last months. Like, what are some of the things that you've uncovered in regards to history, in regards to governmentalism, that have really perked your interest, like that goes against the mainstream narrative? Like, what would be the biggest thing to you that has made you question the narrative that we've been going with in regards to history?
I mean, there are a lot of things. There's one of the things that's fairly key is understanding sort of like the history of banking and the history of usury throughout sort of various countries. And then of course, I mean, you mentioned about the black ops, and that's quite a key thing with America, is learning about a lot of their psychological operations, and a lot of I mean, even down to the word conspiracy theorist. What I heard, the origins of the word was from when Kennedy was assassinated.
Absolutely.
The people who didn't believe, the official story, that they were conspiracy theorists, and it's just a smear term.
Absolutely. This stuff happens all. It's like with the term anti-vaxxers, but keep going, brother. It's like it's been constructed in order to create a narrative that you're a bad person or you're an idiot.
Yeah, and they engage in all these psychological campaigns and all this misinformation. You look at international policy and imperialism. I think in one of my videos a few months ago, I talked a little bit about Operation Ajax, which was in Iran, when the British and the Americans moved in, when the democratically elected prime minister of Iran tried to nationalize British interests in Iranian oil. And so, of course, we destabilized them, basically stir up a mob and try and destabilize the whole thing. And I only recently learned that wasn't the first time they did it. They did it back in 1896 in South Africa, in what was known as the Jameson Raid. So it was trying to, when Cecil Rhodes and, was trying to extend his influence into the region for gold and oil and all the things in South Africa. And he basically went into both the Orange Free State and the South African Republic and tried to stir up mobs and incite violence and try to incite a revolution to topple Paul Kruger. And of course, it completely failed and just escalated tensions, culminating in the Boer War. But it's how it's been used throughout history, and how events are misrepresented and memory hold, how they hide certain things from memory and don't discuss them. Yeah. Like one of the things that woke me up big time was a video that James Corbett, the Corbett Report, put out on YouTube. His channel's long gone now, but he's still on Odyssey and everywhere. It was a video he put out a few years ago on Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. And he was showing, he doesn't have to just sort of speculate and talk to the camera. He was showing it all. The news reports from the time, there were definitely two perpetrators. Every witness saw two perpetrators. And then the FBI and CIA, no, there was only one person. And then all the stories about how Timothy McVeigh left the military. And then 2 years later, there was a video of him in a military base, in military uniform, that matched facial recognition and voice analysis. So Timothy McVeigh was still in the military, and there were letters from him that were later published where he was purporting to have been what was known as sheep dipped, where they take someone in the military, make them look as if they've left the military entirely, and then recruit them in for black ops. And that's when they do all the shady stuff in overseas and drug smuggling, drug trafficking, all that kind of stuff. And how they hypocritically blame other powers like Noriega. They accused him of drug trafficking, which firstly the Americans were engaged in anyway. But the real reason for the Panamanian invasion in 1989 was because Noriega had a lot of information on Bush and recordings of him in negotiation with the Contras, who it was illegal for them to be doing business with. They were designated as terrorists by the US at that point. And so Noriega had this blackmail dossier on President Bush. And they knew that Noriega was a bit of a loose cannon because he'd previously been a purely CIA agent, and he'd been beginning to offer his services to other powers as well. And that was why they knew they had to cap him. They couldn't have anyone who wasn't entirely on the USA's payroll. And it was ironic, Noriega was even given psychological operations training and psychological warfare training by the CIA. That's all documented and official. It's things like, for example, how Osama bin Laden had the highest level of security clearance with the CIA as well, and during the 1980s, during the Afghan-Soviet conflict. And then all of a sudden, immediately when the Soviet Union falls, then all of a sudden there's a CNN interview with bin Laden where he's declaring jihad on America, and then all of a sudden the war on terror stuff happens, and Gladio becomes Gladio B, and time goes on.
No doubt. One of the things that I've seen a lot in recent history and in history is this idea of the science changing. You see the narrative changing so often, like you were saying in regards to Osama bin Laden. But people seem to have this amnesia. Like there was a time, as you were saying, when Osama was supposed to be like a golden boy of the CIA. Same with Saddam Hussein. I mean, he was essentially an ally of the Americans, right? And then at some point, we changed this narrative. People forget that this guy was in our good camps. And we do this on so many levels. I mean, you have a look at, I guess, the most recent phenomenon before this whole COVID thing, right? The situation with Iraq, where essentially we went in there. When I say we, I'm like an American or something. I'm not an American. But essentially the West, or I would say, because it wasn't actually here. I think it was just the US initially. But they went in there with the understanding that they had weapons of mass destruction, right? They didn't find any. And, Iraq was the most evil people ever, talking about the government. But now, after many years, we've realized that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction.
Yep.
Like the narrative has changed. It's not like we went in there to destroy their weapons of mass destruction. Well, they were terrorists. And we somehow moved into this realm of terrorism now. And it wasn't just the Taliban; it was Iraq. Iraq had a link with the terrorists because I know, like I remember seeing some meme one time, like just finding some ridiculous connection between Iraq and the Taliban. Like sometimes people just come up with the most insane connections. And look, bottom line was they tried to find anything they could. And when they couldn't find anything that was legitimate that people didn't buy into, it's like people just conveniently forget that there was no justification. And I would take the leap that this hasn't just been done in recent history, but this has been done with history in general. Like people conveniently forget that there was a time that there were certain things that were established, whether it was like, flat earth, then obviously we conveniently forget that it was the priesthood, the governmental system as such that was perpetuating this fallacious nation, right? And then we find out, yeah, that was all bullshit, that like, look, yeah, we were just silly back then. Let's not focus on the fact that we were essentially persecuting people for this ridiculous belief system, right? And I would actually make the claim that it's not even that outrageous a claim. You have a look at the official narrative when it comes to our involvement with extraterrestrials, because the current narrative, right, is that, oh, look, the U.S. government has had no real contact. They're all of these eyewitness reports. it's nonsense. But the reality is, yeah, there have been many reports that have been not just filed by normal people, but uh, by factions of the military, the Air Force, and so forth. Even President Eisenhower, and this goes into the conspiratorial realm, is said to have been involved in some kind of a contact with a race of aliens. You know, this goes very kind of esoteric, but people that are in the know are aware of this kind of stuff. And I believe that essentially over time, this information is released. People come out with this stuff, and then at some point later on, it's conveniently forgotten. You know, I really think in 100 years or so, it's going to be mainstream knowledge that the government has had contact, I believe, with these extraterrestrials. They've covered a whole bunch of information up, and then it's just going to be overlooked as just being, you know, just an accepted thing, and people forget this stuff. And I think we're seeing this in the same way with the COVID scenario. I mean, not that long ago, we just announced that masks are actually not that effective, right? And people have forgotten just the amount of like anger there was on this topic. Like people were
I got a strike for that.
Absolutely.
I got a strike for saying that.
Yeah, forget that. You'd literally be arrested. People were essentially strangled to death. Well, not to death, but strangled in my suburb at the time, Oakley, for going against this narrative. And then conveniently it's accepted. This is the trajectory of history.
It's how they rather than completely censoring it forever and ever, they, like you said, they make sure it's just forgotten. So they'll censor it at the start and completely throttle it so it loses all momentum. And then by the time that people have forgotten about it, then they gradually ease it. I mean, just two examples. One of them is you mentioned about weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein. Over here in the UK, one of the top government scientists at the time, Dr. David Kelly, he was Tony Blair's advisor, who later on leaked to the press how the report was, in his words, sexed up. So to try and exaggerate the evidence that there was weapons of mass destruction. And then a couple of days later, he mysteriously killed himself by slitting his wrists, taking poison, and slitting his throat in the woods mysteriously. And his autopsy and all of his the inquiry into his death will remain classified until something like 2070 something. So they've shut that one down. But it's even on the ufology topic. Well, I hadn't heard about it, but you were telling me recently about an incident in the 60s in Australia in that school where in Melbourne actually, where they a whole load of kids saw it, and it seemed like at the time they completely strangled it, throttled it, didn't let the word get out. And then now more recently you go to it and it's not so censored. Like you can see all the original news reports, first-hand accounts from the time, so that debunks the fact that it's complete fake news. And then even mainstream media, where you sent me like a panel with people who were witnesses from the time, you know, years and years later, finally speaking out. But because it's over 50 years after the fact, people aren't going to really think it matters. It's just ancient history.
Absolutely. That's actually a brilliant example. I'm glad you brought that because that escaped my mind for a second. But objectively, unassailably, unequivocally, this incident happened in terms of there being something that was spotted by, we're not talking about a group of people here. We're speaking about hundreds of students, school teachers. And the interesting thing is, not only was this stuff censored from the mainstream channels at the time, but literally they took it out of their records. Like there were reporters that actually did research. This is years later. In fact, a few years back when I moved into Westall, this is the area that it happened, there was a reporter that was trying to find the neighbors that were in the area to just see if they'd been there 50 years ago to find out what he could find, because he'd actually gone to the archives, gone to these stations, and they'd taken the footage. They'd taken the reports out. Like you couldn't find, like typically from what I understand, most mainstream stations have a back catalog of the reports that were done even up to 50 years ago, but this stuff had been actually taken out. And what's even crazier is that the people that experienced this close encounter had been confronted by men in black, and this is objective. Like this is from their reports. I mean, when multiple people are saying this, you know, and finally come out and saying that, yeah, look, their lives were ruined because of it. Like a school teacher that actually took a photo of this thing, yes, an unidentified flying object, you know, had his camera taken away and never got it back. There were students that actually ran off. There's a particular kid. This happened, by the way, in 1966. So this is over 50 years ago. I want to understand. Yeah, that'd be about right. But there was a school kid that actually ran off to see an unidentified flying object, and this thing was spotted by many of the students. But this guy actually saw this thing at close hand. And look, it's one thing when you get one report from one person, but when you get multiple, and then when you have people actually corroborating all this information, like actually going a few days later, from what I understand, a guy actually spotted this thing as well, and actually got to see the imprinting on the ground. Like, what do we call these things? Like crop circle kind of markings. Like, this is like legitimate stuff. There'd been something there. He returned the next day though, and after the incident happened, to see if he could find this thing still there, been completely taken out. There was a kid, just to dwell a little on this, because this is actually one of the biggest incidences that has happened. And even if you don't buy into the narrative, this is some kind of flying saucer, 100% there was something that was spotted, and for all means it was unidentified. Like, the ability of this thing to move around like with tremendous speeds, I mean, this was spotted by people, was just unprecedented even to our standards now. But essentially, this thing was spotted by multiple people. There was a censorship campaign. It was a big deal. It was spread across many newspapers. There was a child that actually fainted after coming into proximity to this thing. And she had a close friend that was curious to find out what had happened to her. And she, according to this person, like, they were, pretty good friends for multiple years. And the next day after this incident happened, and after she fainted, she relocated to another school, and there was nothing to be heard about her. Apparently, we find out years later, she'd been thoroughly interviewed by the men in black. She had been taken to a mental institution, and there's all of this crazy stuff surrounding this stuff. And you realize there is a suppression effort. And this thing, like, you can call, some people have theorized that this was military technology, but for someone like myself that is very familiar with the way that this thing was described, it was anything but military. It's quite possible this was reverse engineered. The people like Bob Lazar that have spoken about working on reverse engineering craft like this, and the way that it was described by the people at Westall was described in the same way that Bob Lazar describes this particular craft, how it essentially would tilt and then travel at massive speeds. And you don't need to buy into this idea that, granted, this is an unidentified flying object in the terms of a alien operated craft, but the government suppresses big shit, and then years later, when people forget about it, voila, then they bring it up, and it's no longer a big deal. The amnesic state of humankind. And I would argue that there are many things that have happened throughout history that will blow people's minds, and they're recorded in the ancient texts, but we conveniently forget this stuff. It somehow is taken as not being a thing because it happened many years ago, when it very much changed the entire trajectory of the planet. I mean, there are stories of massive cataclysms in the Earth's history that are such a big event that essentially there was a completely destruction of the planet. I mean, and this corresponds with the Pyramid of Giza, the fact that, I mean, if you buy into this idea of pole shifts, which is supported with this idea of massive like, apparently there's this idea that many thousands of years ago, there would have been some kind of pole shift that was, whether or not that was brought about naturally or through these massive devastations through weaponry or whatnot. This is what's said within the ancient records, right? The evidence, the archaeological evidence supports that, yeah, it's very possible that we saw a pole shift, because we see, for instance, with the Pyramid of Giza, that there are water erosions, all right? Now, this is within an area that there is essentially no greenery, right? It's just a desert place, and it's supposed to have been like that for a very long period of time. But with these water erosions that are very clear to many people like Graham Hancock and other people that are quite open about the evidence, it's clear that many thousands of years ago, what we call Egypt was not a desert plain, which supports the idea that there may have been a pole shift. But anyway, I could rant on about this stuff for a long time, but I want to ask you, you're someone that is very researched, not just into mainstream history. What are your thoughts on, I mean, I know you're a religious person. Like, what do you take on when it comes to humankind, like, do you take on the conventional idea of us coming in? Like, what do you think is the history of human beings on this planet? I know this is going to some very, like, what the fuck kind of area, but do you believe in the theory of evolution? Do you believe in Adam and Eve? What are your thoughts when it comes to how we got here, like the origins of mankind?
I mean, honestly, whatever I say would be entirely speculative. So I don't know. Completely orthodox views appeal to me entirely. I thought there's no way that's completely completely legitimate. Evolution on the scale that it's portrayed doesn't seem to make much sense at all. Granted, evolution on a minor level, where you see evolution of traits and things, makes complete sense. But that suddenly there was, over millions of years, there was nothing, and then two molecules came out of this nothing somehow, which isn't explained, and then they collided somehow and it let off all this force, and out of that everything magically came. And we know that happened because if we scan a laser into space, then it moves away, so that's how we know it's expanding. So we came from a big bang, and that magically on one of these random rocks that formed this planet, then suddenly there was this primordial soup or whatever it was of a perfect mix of everything that used to be under the exact perfect conditions, and the lightning and everything produced life under the most, which even to this day, under exceptionally controlled conditions, they still can't replicate in a lab. And then everything evolved from this little creature that was in the earth, in the water, and then it came out, and that evolved separately into every species and subspecies and category and the entire animal kingdom. To me, that seems completely bananas. Whereas some other views as well, in terms of history, when you look at certain cave paintings and certain there's a famous mausoleum with sculptures of animals and things on, which is believed to be about 30,000 odd years old. So the view that in the Old Testament, where it says, this patriarch, and their exact years in terms of, this person lived for 300 years, this person lived for 200 years, and that is a literal exact telling, that doesn't make much sense to me. But at the same time, in the Bible, when you look at genealogy based on the dispersions of peoples from a lot of the accounts in the Old Testament as well, a lot of that does make sense. And broadly, accounts in Chronicles and Kings and things are some of the most accurate historical accounts we have of certain eras as well. And how ancient some of these texts are and can be proven. And it's even things like when you look at Leviticus, for example. So when people talk about Christianity being homophobic, and they talk about Leviticus, where it says you must not lie with a man as you do with a woman, and that sort of thing. My interpretation of that is when you have to look at it in the context of the immediately surrounding passages. One of the passages, I believe, immediately before reads, if a dead creature lands in one of your pots, you must smash that pot and never use it again. To me, that makes a lot of sense for the time in terms of the technology they had, because they didn't have washing up liquid and soap. So if a dead creature falls in your pot, there's this bacteria, you can get sick and you can die. Likewise, at the time when even heterosexual sex was more dangerous in terms of lack of hygiene, venereal diseases, the risks of pregnancy, and also a smaller population. If people were just running around not procreating, when the population was at a dramatically smaller level, go forth and multiply. It almost seems like, for people's own personal hygiene and safety, and for the progression of humanity, at that point in time, that was probably a key rule for communities to follow, for us to reach this stage. Now, that begs modern day debates about the morality of that today, and whether that means that it's an essential spiritual wrong, that you're somehow doing something evil if you engage in homosexual acts or whatever. And those are debates to be had. But rather than condemning the whole religion or condemning the entire doctrine, analyzing these things in the context to try and put yourself in the minds of someone else, rather than necessarily assuming that they're whatever. And it's how when you look at things through certain contexts, they can be quite surprising. So actually, to use racism as an example, so two things I learned recently of opposite examples. So one of the things is people assume in history that because of the way things are today, the Republicans are far right racist, and the Democrats are the universal champions of human rights. But I was reading recently about I think it was President Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to have dinner at the White House back in, I think it was 1901. And at the time, it was highly controversial among Democrat senators, and it was the Republicans who were pro-integration. I remember I was reading, it was a quote from a Democratic senator that was now we're going to have to lynch 1,000 N-words to put them back in their place. And that was how the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, and how that's changed over time. And how something that you wouldn't think was racist is racist. And then on the other hand, something like, for example, a lot of people say that Al Jolson, the performer, was racist because he performed in blackface, which today is racist. But at the time, Al Jolson, the reason why people pick on him is that he was the most public face in terms of what we have today in surviving media, because he was the first star of a talking picture. And he was in the post blackface era, really. It wasn't as fashionable or trendy, but he actually used blackface as a way of breaking down barriers to get into black music and jazz and things in front of white audiences in segregated theaters. And that was actually towards the end of the 19th century. Blackface performances of things were some of the earliest equal opportunity employers, because when they're all on stage, if there's a theater says, we're racially segregated, if all the performers walking on stage are covered in face paint, that was how they were able to actually sneak black performers in front of white audiences and say they're not actually black. But then that's how through our modern day minds, if you saw a picture of a minstrel show, you think that is racist, and then you learn the context behind it, how it could be an example of something else. There's always more than meets the eye, and how something that, no matter how incriminating it looks at first sight, can always beg further analysis, and that you can always change someone's mind with more information.
That's a really salient point. I think it's important to understand the context in which something is written, particularly with the Bible. I mean, you made the distinction there, in my mind, between something that is written about within a moral context and something that is perhaps just good advice. I mean, to me, it's not a moral thing necessarily to be hygienic, right? But it might be a good idea not to eat something if it's been in a pot, if that thing was dead and it's been in a pot, right? Not because of any kind of moral idea. And you might be able to say the same thing in regards to many things that are within the Bible, but because we're looking at these things, one, with this mindset of the modern era, where we don't understand the context in which it was written, and that combined with the fact that many of these things, like with the Bible, that was written a long time ago. It's been rewritten many times through different techniques, like the Pesher technique, that tends to embellish things. But there are many aspects to the way in which things are rewritten, right, for the modern man, that takes away the actual meaning, and that you'll have to mind the noise of. This is the first time I've done a podcast outside. That might be a little disturbing, but essentially, I find that this contextual understanding is relevant not only in perhaps more kind of practical things like our interpretation of the Bible, but I would say in understanding of many of the things that have been written throughout the ages. I try to understand what they were like. We read a lot of the mythology. I made this point earlier of ancient civilizations like the ancient Sumerians. They have this record dating back many thousands of years, the cuneiform writing speaking about their history, how they got the first of many things that make up a civilization. And they also speak about the origins. Interesting to note, there are many of their Genesis stories actually tie up so much with the Bible in terms of the references they make to Eden, to the Adama, which they call Adam and Eve. But I think there's a lot of correlation there, but that's another thing. But I think it's important to understand that the way in which these people many thousands of years ago wrote about things, not perhaps being as technically advanced as we are, they would speak about these things, trying to describe them within their worldview. So where is they talking about things like the gods, right? This is my kind of interpretation of this. They're actually making reference to perhaps beings that had advanced technology. And we're interpreting this stuff when we read the cuneiform writings as, oh, you're talking about fairy beings. This kind of stuff can't be real. But in actual fact, they were objectively explaining what was happening in their time, but through the lens of, like you speak about, let's say, a flying saucer. If a human being thousands of years ago looks at a flying craft, they're going to think, oh, this is a chariot, perhaps, like a wheel within a wheel that is breathing fire. They'll describe this as some kind of like perhaps relatable thing to their times. So as a result, if we read this within the context of, oh, this must be a fairy tale, it doesn't make as much sense. But when we read this stuff within the context of, these are people that are explaining phenomenon that they did not have the references to accurately portray, at least if you compare it with our understanding now. And I think the Bible is is another thing. I think a lot of the things that we're speaking about are actually in reference to things that took place, as fantastical as they sound. Like when we're talking about, like, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but some people have made the connection that when in the Bible there's this reference to the earth being created within 6 days, 7 days, or something like that. Perhaps a day is in reference to something that is taking millennia, eons, and perhaps the process is not. I mean, when we refer to God as being this being from the sky, per se, perhaps it's in reference to something that we can't comprehend. Or perhaps, I know this offends a lot of people, but once again, if you base this on the Enuma Elish, this is the ancient creation stories, and you have a look at what they're citing a place called Eden, where this stuff was actually taking place. This is supposed to be the genesis of mankind. They make reference to the creation of the first human being, the Adama. They're actually referring to not a being per se, but a race of people. Just shifting the context of that, like, it makes you realize that it's quite possible that, once again, these people were referring to some kind of advanced technology. It's quite possible that they're, in the same way we're able to create things in a lab right now through whether it's cross hybridization. And this is actually what is not just alluded to, like, very clearly within these writings. Some people, some critics have said, oh, there are different interpretations of this. But when you really delve into this, you realize that, yeah, there's slightly different ways of interpreting this, but those that have actually read it are arriving at the same interpretation. And you can actually learn how to read within this system and actually go read it for yourself, which is something I'm looking at doing now. Because it's one of the things we do as human beings is we just take on the information from other people. Like, someone obviously wrote the Bible, right? And has interpreted this thing in his own way from something else. But when you actually go to the source and you interpret this stuff for yourself, then you can make your own understandings of what is going on. And I think it's really important to do that, because you have a look at what is going on right now. This is tying this to the whole COVID thing. And most people aren't actually looking at the data. Most people are just saying what journalists, not even scientists, journalists have reported, and saying that this is the truth. And this is why we get bad science, right? Like, oh, masks and lockdowns are super effective. But anyway, that's my long rant on that. I just think it's a very interesting area. And I think if we apply the same kind of perhaps critical thinking and more understanding, scientific understanding that we do, like people that are really trying to understand what's going on in terms of the current situation, pandemic. If we applied that to history, we'd have a better understanding. Because check this out: if the media is lying to us, right, in recent times, imagine how bad history is. Imagine if we're living in a completely obfuscated understanding of what has happened. I mean, imagine if. And this is probably going to get me into a lot of trouble, right? Because look, by no means am I a supporter. I mean, clearly, I'm not. Hell, I don't care what you look like, But imagine if Hitler wasn't this person that we paint him out to be. Perhaps imagine just maybe, and I personally don't even believe this. I don't believe this at all. But perhaps the stories in regards to him wanting to create this pure race, and I can just imagine a society where the way in which we obfuscate the narrative with what's going on with COVIDs, right? Perhaps it's possible that that's been manifested with what's going on with other things, and as unpleasant as it is to think that, because we deem these figures as being absolutely abominable, what if the story is not like that? And it's important, I think, to be open enough to even question things that you're not uncomfortable with. I mean, you question things that make you uncomfortable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's keeping an open mind and not letting that mind be closed, and going to the source, going firsthand. What's this person saying, rather than what's the mainstream press saying about this person? If you know what I mean. And it's looking at things in context, looking at things with nuance, and that's what the mainstream media seems to lack, and that's what it seems to be sort of trying to drum out of people, is this ability to think for yourself. Everything has to sort of be very black and white. It has to fit into this very specific structure of either it is completely on the mainstream media, or else it's completely fake news. And to be honest, there is fake news in our community. You do see, like, a video might go around that isn't real, or pictures of things, and misinformation is shared. 100%. Likewise, in mainstream media, there's honesty. There's honest journalism in the mainstream press, as well as very, very dishonest journalism. And it's a case that you shouldn't develop an attitude that just because something comes from a certain source, it's either always accurate or always inaccurate. And that's what the mainstream media just wants to try and crack down on. Unless it appears in our print, then it's all fake news.
Absolutely. And look, I'm going to take a stab at the truth movement, right? Those that are kind of in the woke community, those that are not on team meh, as I like to say. But I feel like there's a tremendous amount of disinformation that comes out of that community as well. Like there are, this is going to be very divisive, but there are people that want to pretend that everyone is part of controlled opposition. I mean, I see people that are doing incredible work. I don't know if you've gotten this, but are definitely don't get everything right. I sure as hell don't get everything right. That's for sure. I'm sometimes, that's why I take on the role of just being a comedian, so people don't take me so seriously and like, oh, you're trying to fuck things up. It's like, no, I'm just having a go, but this is what I think. But they take a stab at anyone that like diverts from something that they believe. And as a result, they call them controlled opposition. They say, I have friends that think people like Rainer Fuellmich, who's done amazing work, by the way. He's one of these German lawyers that has set up working with a team of other lawyers, has actually taken it to the man and is actually trying to get these people like in prison, people that have orchestrated horrible things, that have been part of essentially this agenda where we're taking away people's rights, but even more than that, intentionally trying to go into anyway. I think you get the idea. YouTube, obviously, I don't want to go into it.
I've seen a lot of that stuff. It's some people just, it's this inflexible view that everybody who says something that you disagree with, or in some instances there's no justification at all aside from I don't like that person, they therefore draw the conclusion that they must be a con artist. I saw this in the UK. There was a big YouTube channel last year, but it seems to have gone inactive, that was called John Overkill. And what the channel used to do is it would take just little scraps of footage from protests and things and just slow them down, not have any actual content or not actually point anything out, but just be his voice talking over a clip of someone and go, this person is controlled opposition and they're working for the police. There was never any evidence to substantiate it. And at the moment, there's actually a bit of drama going on in the YouTube community with the truth movement live streamers. There's sort of a clique that very often turns up to all the protests. And I was watching one of the original streamers called Tyrant Finder. I was watching his stream the other day, and he was talking about how rather than pointing out some of these people as being controlled opposition, he was talking about his issues with them, but he was rather saying how he believes that some of them were very self-motivated and some of them were acting dishonestly, and was using specific examples from his experiences. This was a time when I was waiting at this place and I saw them coming and they ran off and they wouldn't talk to me, and going more for and I'm not taking a side on this because I'm not involved in that. I have no idea who's done what and what all the ins and outs of it is, and it's probably a more nuanced story than you'll ever get from either one side or the other. But it's a case that he's making his grievances known without saying, they have no credibility, they're fake news, because that's quite an immature, juvenile, rigid way of handling things.
I think it's an ideological way of looking at things. Like what happens within certain political camps is as soon as you target anyone that is supposed to be on your side, like you criticize them, you're considered, not part of the movement. Like you're a racist or a sexist or something like that. I've seen this happen with various figures. I think this is what's happening with Joe Rogan. Like he classically is not considered to be, any person that is like a pro-freedom person. Like he's more probably leftist, in a lot of areas. However, because he's had certain guests, he's given them a platform. People like Robert Malone, people like Peter McCullough, and so forth. Simply giving these people a voice, and perhaps even paying lip service to some of their ideas is enough for him to get put into, you're not on our team. And I often say this because I'm in many movements. People would consider me in the Black community, people consider me in the animal rights community, in the freedom community, in the bleeding heart liberal community. But the thing is, I don't serve any of these camps. And I openly say this. I believe, like, granted, I'm not going to go after people, unless I really think they crossed the line and I'm definitive, like that they've done something that is like effed up. But my whole attitude is I'm not interested in playing team whatever, because I think that's the problem in the world. It's like, rather than actually looking at the actual science, which is not based. Science doesn't care about your race per se. Now, it may make certain findings about your race, that are actually scientifically based, but it doesn't mean it's racist. It just cares about the truth. It doesn't. The truth doesn't think doesn't care about, doesn't have any motivation behind anything. And people think when you speak the truth, you must be of a particular ideology. And that's the freaking problem at the moment. That's how the world looks at a lot of these people that are simply just expressing objective truths. And I think the biggest danger is succumbing to this team mentality, because it's the team mentality that prevents you from looking at the truth for what it is, because you don't want to be taken out of your account. Because I think human beings, this is just my philosophy, we're very tribal. And the last thing we want is not to be accepted by our tribe. This is why a lot of people, they don't want to be deemed as anti-waxers, because the community is going to look at them unfavorably. And I've experienced this to the point where I haven't been questioning what I want to do, but I've been thinking, well, look, if I'm trying to establish myself as an artist, as a musician right now, and people have put me, and the media has put me into this camp where I can't be accepted, I can't go to these places, I can't have my stuff out there because I'm not with the team. Well, maybe I have to start reconsidering how I do things, which is what a lot of people are facing, like with Novak Djokovic. How do you feel about what happened to him? Because I'm sure you've been keeping apprised about that whole situation. Because here's a guy that's not doesn't identify as an anti-vaxxer per se, doesn't identify as like he's in all these different camps. He's in the plant-based camp. He's into the anti-vaxxer camp, but he's not any of these things. He just is doing his own thing, but he's been labeled.
He's him, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also when you look at Serbia, when you look at some of the information that's circulating out there and how honest the press is, their overall take-up, I believe, is just below 50%, or at least it was a couple of weeks ago when the situation was in full swing. Sure. And the way the press and the media, because I was doing some research into Serbian media at the time for a video. I never actually made the video, but I came across a coalition of all of the major pharmaceutical companies in Serbia produced a leaflet, and in that leaflet it was general safety about taking the juice, and it actually said that it basically said for pregnant women, the side effects are not known. It is not recommended unless there is very extreme specific circumstances in which the mother has been advised to take it. So it's almost like a fairly typical attitude for Serbia, or what the press is circulating, and it shows how what the media represents varies from country to country, and it's culturally specific. But also with Novak Djokovic, he wasn't kicked out because he broke the law. He wasn't kicked out because he was unvaccinated. He was promised an exemption, assured that he had an exemption to play in the Open, because he'd had proof of a previous positive test.
He did have an exemption.
So they allowed him into the country. They said he could play. They then detained him, and then they took him to court. And there was a legal battle about whether or not he had an exemption to play. And the court decided that he had an exemption, and he was released from detention, and he was due to play in the Open again. And then the Australian government stepped in and said, no, if he plays, then there'll be riots from the anti-vaxxers or some other nonsense. And so they detained him and immediately kicked him out of the country. I mean, technically it's legal, I guess. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the Australian legal system, but it seems very shady.
I just want to just add in on that, because like ultimately you can justify anything with the current legal system. I mean, I've had people that have been targeted because they've said something that could potentially influence people to do something, which is exactly what happened to Djokovic, right? If you can make that argument, then you can make any legal argument you want. It's all subjective. But you make a really good distinction there in regards to Djokovic, because on one hand, there was this whole thing in regards to the legitimacy of his exemption, which he actually had, right? But then once he got that through, the other thing was around whether or not he was a threat to Australians, right? Yeah. Because the argument that just blew my mind was that the Australian government essentially said that because Djokovic playing is going to inspire anti-vaxxers to disregard laws and so forth. These laws, by the way, that violate your human rights. We're not going to allow him to play because he may, even though we know he's not a danger, on a medical level. Yeah, granted, he has immunity, and we acknowledge the fact that yes, that is a thing. No, we're still not going to let him play because he has been too much of an anti-vaxxer, even though he's just said publicly that, look, if from what I understand, all he said previously before this thing popped up was that, look, if they mandated this thing, this is a couple of years back, he probably would not play, I mean, and obviously he's found a way around it. But the way in which we're defining anti-vaxxer now, technically he is an anti-vaxxer because he's against mandates. If we're mandating that you have to be raped by the government, and you're against that, well, you're an anti-rapist, and we can't have that. And it sounds ridiculous, right? But that's effectively what we're seeing. The people just don't want to have the honesty in actually acknowledging what is going on. Then much like I'm going through Tinder profiles all the time right now, and like dating apps, just looking at the dumb things girls say, like like if you're against mandates, if you're an anti-vaxxer, then you're a crazy person. And then I question them. I'm like, what? So you're against me not wanting to be raped? And they're like, they're just this stump. They have nothing to say. And there's some people that are honest about it. But how you finding? Here's another topic, man. I want to get into a little, like in terms of, I guess the human element, like interactions with people, because these are very controversial things. I think these hit at our ideological, philosophical, moral stance on things. It's creating some kind of division. You strike me as the kind of person you typically get along. You're a jolly good person. You touch on some very confronting topics, but I think when people interact with you, particularly offline, they don't feel as if you're an aggressive, antagonistic person. But in your day-to-day interactions with people, are you finding this thing to be very polarizing? What's the assessment in the UK? Like people stand, particularly in the dating world.
I mean, yeah, it seems to be. I mean, generally, society was more divided during the start of all this. I mean, you saw everywhere about hashtag COVIDiots and all this stuff about any people who didn't wear their mask, and you don't see it anymore. And it seems like the on average, people are far more accepting and far less willing to comply with these mandates. Although there are still a great many who are happy to roll over and take it from the government. But it seems like on a day-to-day basis, I mean, it's quite hard for me to tell at the moment because at my last job, bear in mind, I started working there around May, and pretty much everyone there was on board with, oh, I'm so excited to go down to the clinic. I got my appointment tomorrow, all this. Except for one other person who was against it, but for the most part, everyone was supporting it at that point. But when I started making YouTube videos, I mean, I was never the most popular guy at uni. I had a lot of problems with people, but at uni, the last friends I had, they basically everyone I knew in person. Once I started going public, at one of the protests, I started sharing around footage and coming out, and this enough is enough. I need to speak out about this, and began making my opinions known. Then people just began completely cutting me off. So pretty much that was it in that regard. So I mean, the only people who've actually haven't cut me off or agree with me are invariably people who were international students or people who I know internationally, over in Poland, in China, in America, all around the world. And generally, and that's why I was surprised at how the UK protest movement was growing, because I always thought the UK were generally a much more sheepish people. I mean, we're always the first to roll over and give up our guns, or roll over and give up. We submit to the TV license, for goodness sake. So I was surprised to see that none of that really sort of rang true. I mean, the British people have been a lot more moderate in a lot of ways, where in some other countries situations need to escalate beyond, and there's less dialogue. But the British people, I guess because they're not naturally an aggressive protesting people, seeing the enormous turnout, which was pretty much unprecedented at the rallies and protests and things, was a demonstration to the government that if the British people are protesting over this in these numbers, then something must be up, and so the government must back off a bit. But on a day-to-day social thing, I mean, I haven't, to be honest, really been very socially engaged for quite a few months, generally since the whole pandemic thing began. So I wouldn't really be able to sort of give too much of a gauge, like on sort of things like the dating scene and the socializing scene and things, because I've been out of those for a good few months now. But I mean, focusing on YouTube and other things as well. But it's a mix, and it's also depends where you go in the country as well. I mean, when I went up to see my brother recently, I went up north to Liverpool, and up there the mask wearing rates are virtually zero. When you go to the shops and you go places, there's no one's out wearing masks. Whereas down south, depending on where you go, on some days there are very few people, but it almost seems like generally a majority, probably around 50% down here, are wearing masks compared with up north. So it even depends on whereabouts within the country you go, I guess.
That's interesting. Do you feel as if just the awareness of what's happened, people's attitudes towards this stuff, that has made you reconsider your interactions with people? I mean, whereas you mentioned some people have chosen to not have you in their life because of your position on this thing, of I guess the realization in regards to how people treat you and all this kind of stuff and their views, has that shaped any of the attitudes you have towards wanting to form relationships? Like, are there like deal breakers that you have now, or like what's your perspective on, I mean, on people when it comes to their stance on this stuff? Are you more open, or do you find you tend to cut people out straight away, like, oh really, you're an anti-mask or a vaxxer or something like that?
To be honest, generally I've been fairly wary. Like I guess, I mean, you could probably say I have trust issues, to be honest, but I've been very wary where it comes to sort of getting close to people or interacting with people and things like that. I've been I mean, I've definitely not been the best with replying to people who contact me online at all for a good few months. I've been very withdrawn in that regard. But I mean, generally, it's yeah, it depends, I guess, really.
Yeah, I remember hearing, I want to say it's a John Lennon quote, you know, like the more real you become in this world, like the less the more unreal this world gets, you know. Like just basically what I got from that, at least what I'm trying to say, is that if you are going to be someone that is very honest about everything, how you feel, your attitudes towards people, you find yourself coming to this conclusion that you can't jive with everyone. You're not all in this together. And it's a very difficult attitude to take, particularly if you're a more compassionate, like I want to love and love everyone kind of person, love and be loved kind of person, because you realize there are some people that you just don't resonate with because they're actively calling for you to not be able to exist in society unless, of course, you comply, you know. And you would just say, "Oh, just do it anyway." But it's like, if I compromise how I feel about something, then I'm no longer who I am. Like if I give up my principles and I start acquiescing to something just because you want me to be that person, I no longer am who I am. Now I'm just someone that bends to the will of society, and I'm like basically a cork in the sea, you know. And that's not me. That's being fake, you know, as opposed to yeah, someone that actually is going to be real about how they feel. But I find in order just to deal with people, I've had to compartmentalize myself. You know, there are some people I hang out with where I'll just be fake and, you know, chameleon. And I find typically, as much as I hate to say this is me just bearing out my soul here. Like most of the interactions I have with like people, particularly in the dating world, is not in terms of like I'm looking for a long-term partner. Like I'm looking for someone that I can be real with, because if I'm going to be real with you, we're not going to get along, you know, unless you're a rare breed of people that actually feels the same way I do. I'm not going to see something long term. It doesn't mean I can't hang out with you, but if we're being real about this thing, it's not going to work, right? And then the other, I mean, it's difficult enough as it was before all of this COVID stuff broke out, right? Like you're just finding someone that you want to spend your time with in terms of on a long-term level. There's some, I mean, you got to find someone you can actually tolerate, then you're not just physically attracted to. Because this is the issue I think a lot of guys have, right? It's one thing finding someone that you're attracted to, but finding someone that you're going to meet mind to mind with, that's a tough thing, you know. Particularly when I find men and women are so very different to begin with. You know, it's hard enough finding friends that you can jive with, but then like there's so many other factors that come into play on a sex level, you know. And I actually do believe that there are distinctions between sexes, and then you bring in so many. Like I actually met someone recently that was telling me about how, like, she was, you know, picky enough as it was, but then she started talking about all this other stuff, like, I don't want to be with someone unless, of course, they haven't received the juice. I don't want to be with someone unless, of course, they have this attitude, like, because they're thinking about kids and their future and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, whoa, I don't even enter these conversations because I don't think it's going to go down well. But she was being really confronting. Not only was she wanting to know all these deep little details about me, you know, but my stance on the juice and so forth. And I typically avoid that because I realize I'm going to reach a point where it's like, I can't be with you. And they're going to realize that. But because I'm a human being, I'm a guy, I obviously want to have some kind of like company, you know, definitely on an intimate level. And if you're one of these people that's like, you bring all of these different circles of yourself into one, like the level of friendship, the level of intimacy, like the requirements you have to be someone's friend, the requirements you have to be intimate with someone, the requirements you have to get along with someone intellectually, you're going to find that you are in this Venn diagram that is very, very small. And it's very difficult to find people that you can encompass within this space. So you find yourself not having any partners or even friends for
Especially in
that
these
matter.
days.
Yeah.
Especially these days where they're trying to not only make it so polarizing and so divisive, but also how the media almost weaponizes people against each other and scapegoats certain individuals. And it's just so easy with the intensity and the lack of humanity. And I honestly think online dating and online technology and things certainly hasn't helped it in a way, like where dating and relationships and things have almost been turned into a commodity with the likes of Tinder and whatnot, and how it's become the norm rather than breaking things off or whatever. It's become the norm that you ghost someone or whatever, and that sort of thing on rather than forming these human connections. And it's when you hear people in certain circles talking about their views on relationships versus other people's views on relationships. Some people can be very scheming and very manipulative, and it's very easy to have a lot of negative experiences and get burned and feel like, damn, this isn't worth it, because when you get so invested into a person, into something, and it reaches such a point, and then it breaks down and happens, repeatedly, and the way it's become, rather than just the breakdown in relations between two people, but has to become part of some bigger political cause. That's what makes it almost harder pill to take.
But in a way, it's even forced us to be so open about everything. Like, typically speaking, when you meet someone, like this is in the 70s, there's certain things you learn about them, but because you really like them, you're willing to overlook them. The way in which so many of these dating apps work, you're putting everything out there, like your juice status, everything about yourself, that just the very act of doing that, I mean, you could say it's for the better, right? Because straight up how someone feels about things, but it makes it more divisive in that you're immediately saying, you're not going to get along with me, no, because of this and that. And I feel as if we're moving into a society where everything is out in the open. You're going to know everything about everyone. And where some people like that, it brings about this uncomfortable reality that the more and more you learn about people, the more you realize sometimes that they are not going to jive with you. Like, if I know, for instance, how exactly someone views me, right? Like someone, like, let's say as a guy, you're looking for someone, you don't perhaps care whether or not someone is going to feel the same way you do about the boom shakalaka, but you just care about, let's say having sex with them, right? That in the future is going to be immediately known. And women are going to be able to read that stuff straight away, even though they can kind of get that just by looking at you and the kind of attitude you have. And as a result, they cut you out. But it's also done in terms of like what you want to do with your life, how you feel about X and X. I truly believe in the future, we're going to have this technology that allows us to scan each other immediately to know how we feel about everything. And granted, that makes things more transparent. It also makes things more divisive, I find. And it's just something I've been thinking about, in the way that in the 70s, these things weren't immediate things that were made privy to someone. Therefore, it made it easier in order to, like, you just associate with people, learn things about them. Now everything is out in the open. A bank can find out everything about you, your habits, your status, your affiliations, and so forth, and say, oh, you affiliated with this King Peter character. Yeah, look, he's a shady character. We can't have you here. I don't want to be friends with you. And as a result, just by the very aspect of how we distribute information, it's very divisive. It's very discriminatory. And whereas I say people have a right to decide who they want to interact with, the way things are headed, society is not going to be very fun if we adopt this attitude of being so judgmental in regards to this stuff, right? What are your thoughts?
Completely othering people, like rather than this is a fellow human being who shares a different opinion to you on the matter. This is a terrible anti-vaxxer, evil person who's killing the elderly and is going to kill your granny. And it's in everything, and it goes back to the social media thing and all that. How creating this as a commodity almost dehumanizes people to an extent even just on any other level, not even necessarily political, but to the point where it's very easy to, because there's this barrier, it's not like a human being you're immediately interacting with. It's a lot easier to be overtly spiteful or whatever, or things like not telling the truth and that kind of thing. What would, face to face be, obvious? There's a moral compass going off that I'm lying to you, I'm this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
Whereas over social media, and it's a chat or whatever, there's, what are the stakes? There's, this isn't a person, this is text on a screen, and
Absolutely.
it's, you play your cards right, you get sex one night, and then probably the next day you don't speak to him ever again after that.
That's
And
true.
it's,
And
yeah, it's dehumanizing.
it is dehumanizing. And look, there are definitely pros and cons in this world, like when it comes to technology. And I guess it's about, like, I think something ceases to be a technology when you are no longer benefiting from it more than you are getting a detriment, And the way that society has been constructed with a lot of the technology now, granted, it seems like things are better for us. We're actually losing, for instance, real connectivity, like when maybe someone is many miles away from you, it makes sense to communicate with them through text and so forth.
You see,
When
this is good use of technology right here.
Yeah, sure, because I
human
can't,
connection
I can't go to
intellectual
Yeah,
discussions.
absolutely. But if like you live down the road, man, and I was like rather than actually coming up and like seeing you face to face, I had to do this kind of, like granted it has conveniences, but there is something you lose, right? When you don't have the actual real thing. And the point I'm trying to make is that I think we're using technology in a way now that is perhaps not best used. Like the way that we're overusing this social media, the way that's been perverted as a way of rather than communication and trying to perhaps sell your content. It's just a way of like, everybody look at me. And look, if anyone is to blame for this kind of stuff, it's me. Like I am the biggest selfie whore. I'm constantly like showing my abs, showing my ass and so forth. But I do see a lot of opportunity for this stuff to be abused and not work in your true benefit. All right, I want to go into some bonus content here. This is going to be for my Patreons, and I want to bring this stuff up because I know it's not going to work well with YouTube. So, all right, one of the things I've been meaning to get a discussion on with you about is this whole thing around vapes. Let me get this straight though. So basically, there are no restrictions in the UK right now. Like you don't have to wear a mask. You don't need to get the juice in order to go into a store. I mean, you can essentially travel around the UK without any of this issue.
Yeah, the only thing is with international travel, how it's things like masks on planes and with testing. So if you're unvaccinated, you have to test on arrival. But that doesn't even really matter because at the end of this month, so going into March, if you test positive, you won't have to isolate at all. So they'll just be treating it like anything else. So there'll be no isolation after positive tests. There'll be no government mandated mask wearing. So some shops and things do still say you have to wear a mask. You walk in, no one says anything to you because no one wants the conflict anymore.
Sure.
It's because I recently actually heard from my university. So I was due to graduate. Well, I finished my degree back in 2020, but because of this horrible situation, we couldn't have graduation. So they've announced that our graduation is going to happen in April, and I already got my diploma in the post and everything. There's no point in going, so I'm not going to bother going to that one.
Well, congratulations, it's official. So you're an official. What does that mean? Like you're a lawyer now, or you got to take a bar or something?
No, there's so many steps to that. There's if I wanted to become a barrister, I'd have to go on and do a BPTC and then a pupillage and then a mini pupillage and then another thing. And then if I wanted to be a solicitor, I'd have to go off and take the is it the GDL and then something else and they make it so long and laborious and you have to give so much blooming money and quite frankly it's not worth it. And my experience in the legal system has taught me no respect for it. Really, the more and more I learn about it, the more I have nothing but contempt for our English courts as they stand today, to be honest. They're not a representation of the law at all. They're a house of corruption.
That's how I feel. The more I learn about the legal system, I get frustrated because I realize they circumvent like the common law and things like that. And you're like, what? I have to go and defend this kind of stuff. And I look at the future though, and one of the great things about what's happening in the crypto space, particularly, is that you can bypass a lot of the licensing that is required. Like if you just want to get paid for the work that you're doing, I mean, you could transfer, cryptocurrencies. And I'm not advocating for this, by the way. That's kind of weird. I'm just saying that it's how I say you can do this stuff, but not advocating. But you know what? Fuck it. I am advocating for it. If you want to give people legal advice, because the idea in my mind that it's somehow wrong, illegal to give someone advice because you're not a qualified liar, like you haven't gone through the system where you have to adhere to these regulations that prevent you from telling the truth, like what's happening with a lot of the doctors right now, right? It's insane to me. So like, I would like to see a system where people can get legal advice from someone like yourself, or even medical advice, right, from a doctor that has not been overcome by these organizations, right, the World Health Organization and so forth, like APRA in Australia. And you can just bypass all of that stuff. You can send them money, and voila. Who's gonna what? I mean, granted, people say that everything's traced on the blockchain. Well, no, there are privacy coins like Monero and so forth that avoid that stuff, and you can get legitimate advice. So, I guess that brings it back to being aware of this. Have you figured out what you want to do in terms of your career, whether you want to go into this field? Because I got the vibe that you're not sure if you're going to explore the conventional avenues in the law.
I'm not really sure. I mean, to be honest, when I graduated and everything, I couldn't have taken any further education anyway, because I had no money, and there was no way I could have been able to afford it. I then went and I was applying for months and months for jobs, very, very, very entry level, simple jobs in different areas. And because of just how bad the economy had been hit at the start of all this, no one was hiring. And I was going to interviews and all kinds of things, and no one was hiring. And I eventually managed to land a marketing sales job, just cold calling people for a tech company. And the pay was decent, but it wasn't a particularly enjoyable job, sort of cold calling people who had no intention of talking to me, and selling a product that I hadn't even really been trained to sell properly, and it wasn't the most ideal situation. But I left that with the intention of pursuing sort of YouTube content creation, online, general online stuff, as a full-time career option. But while I was, it was kind of like I broke the routine. I was going to work every day. I was struggling to put out YouTube content, but then the momentum ran down, and I went through like a bit of a period of depression and didn't know what was going on. So I took some time off for a few months. And I'm still sort of trying to find my footing coming back. I think generally what I want to do is sort of find a way to try and monetize online stuff, because I enjoy doing this research. I enjoy presenting. I enjoy creating, the creative side of things. And if there is an option that would allow me to actually live on more than 3 figures a year, that would be potentially nice. But it's not ideal at the moment, to be honest. I don't even know. I'm pretty confused. But I feel like sort of online content creation is what I want to get into full time.
Absolutely. I think whatever you're doing now in terms of creating the content and the experiences that you have now, I think the future is going to pave the way to really monetize that. We're seeing that through the cryptocurrencies and more online social media platforms that are more censorship resistant coming about. But one of the things I believe is, if you're ever trying to figure out what you should do, what direction you should go in, you have a look at the tools that you already have and what you've already done in the past to kind of see the trajectory that you're already on. And the fact that you have this tremendous legal understanding now, obviously having graduated, and you're well researched. Like, for the viewers out there, I have these long, like 25-minute back and forth conversations with King Peter here, and I get like this awesome podcast. It's like I'm listening to a combination of the Joe Rogan Experience / some scientific expose. So this guy is a knowledge powerhouse, and I think with that knowledge that you've acquired throughout your years, you're a young gun, but you obviously enjoy researching and reading. I think that you've learned skills and you see where you're going. I think the idea of perhaps using those skills in order to make a living is the direction that you should be headed in, because that's where you have been headed. So figure out where you've been in order to determine where you should go. or just follow what you're most passionate about. And obviously, you care about what's going on. You're interested in a variety of things. Why not monetize that stuff, brother? You know, that's what I'm trying to do. I put everything out on the blockchain now. I not only put out these podcasts, but everything I do. You know, that's why I'm always, at least that's what I tell myself. That's why I'm showing people these tweets of my abs and whatnot. I'm trying to like monetize the health world, you know, and like trying to get people healthy and that. But I think to reach a point where you do what you love doing and are able to make a living from that, that's the future. Because there's all you need is a creative mind that has the ability to figure out how to do something that you love doing and monetize that shit. Because trust me, there is an avenue for it. It's just a matter of getting good enough at it so that you become an authority or someone that it is able to pull enough people to watch you and so forth. And you definitely have that. I always say, man, you are the most likable figure on YouTube. I know you say a lot of people don't like the kind of stuff you say, but I think that's unavoidable. If someone is not hated at all, then trust me, there's something really really like a real kind of a issue there, you know, like with the Trudeau thing. There was a point when I realized that apparently no Canadians hate this guy, and I was like, oh really? I got to look into this guy. And now it's all coming out. You're like, oh yeah, there's something really fishy about this guy. And recently he's become one of the most hated people, I think, in my opinion, in the world right now, because there's so much BS within what he's saying. Like he's trying to please everyone, but then it comes out. But I just want to say, brother, keep doing what you're doing. I think a lot of people get great information and find you as a source of inspiration as well. And the fact that you have this legal understanding, it's really paved the way. I, for one, enjoy your videos, even though they're coming out as frequently anymore. And brother, keep being
more frequent going forward.
Absolutely, a gentleman, and keep dropping the amazing knowledge that you're doing. I'm going to wind things down. Was there anything that you wanted to bring up that we can get to people?
No, I think that was excellent, and I think we dived into quite a wide range of topics there. As always, it's always fantastic speaking with you. We always get into some of the more off topic topics, the things that aren't really discussed as often, and likewise, you're a source of inspiration. Everyone in this movement who's genuine, and I think people know in their hearts that obviously people who are actually the content creators themselves know in their hearts, but I also think audiences can also smell a phony a mile off. You can often smell when something's not quite right. And I think it's for everyone. People go through rough periods, and things don't turn out right for everyone, but in the end, you do what you can to sort of overcome whatever obstacles are sort of come your way, and overcome. And I think that's the key moving forwards, is no matter how bad the situation in the world is, or on a personal level, it's never over. It's never just game over. There's always ways forwards, and unless you go through negative times, there's never going to be any positive times. Everything's all subjective. There's no good without the bad.
Absolutely. And I can definitely say that we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of years since you started dropping these videos. And I think a lot of that is because of what people like yourself have been doing. People say that these protests talking about this stuff doesn't work, but it's had that exact effect. It's led to a changing of restrictions. I mean, the politicians have feared for what's happening to them. And I assure you, what's going on in Canada is representative of that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if this Trudeau guy gets kicked out, because people are feeling the effects of what people like you are saying and are doing as well. So keep fighting the good fight, keep being a source of inspiration. If people want to get a hold of King Peter the Virile, I always call you King Peter. I know you actually have a name, but no, you are you truly carry yourself like a man of regal status, man, and you have all the virtues of a philosopher king. So kudos to you. If people want to get a hold of
hopefully
you,
a good regal, and not someone like Prince Andrew or someone.
Oh, absolutely. But look, you're on Rumble. I know you're on Odyssey. You're on the YouTube. I would say you're primarily a YouTuber at the moment, but you're probably expanding yourself into some other avenues. I definitely want to see so. I'll put your links below. Ladies and gentlemen, check out Peter. I know a lot of his subscribers have probably checked out my stuff. I'm more on the weird kind of science vibe, but it is great having this guy drop all this knowledge, and where I'm going to be doing these podcasts hopefully more regularly with you. I'd love to see you start a podcast as well, brother. Just throwing that out there.
There's so many things to do.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Peter, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks again for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure having you for the last couple of hours. And until next time.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Indeed. Peace out, my brother.
Bye-bye.
Ow!
You won't work it, don't pay the price, you won't make it.